Hello and welcome to Duke Reads. I'm Frank Stasio, host of the State of Things on North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC. Tonight, Oscar Hijuelos, professor of the practice of English at Duke, is our guest. He was born of Cuban parents in New York City. Oscar Hijuelos is the author of 8 novels, among them The Mambo King's Play Songs of Love, which won the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction and earned him the distinction as having been the first Latino to do so. It was translated into 25 languages, and his books have been published around the world. His most recent novel is Beautiful Maria of My Soul. It came out last June on Hyperion Books, and a memoir entitled Thoughts Without Cigarettes is being published by Gotham Penguin Books. Should be coming out this June. He's also been the recipient of the Rome Prize in Literature, a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, and there have been other awards as well. Also, a National Hispanic Heritage Award in the Arts. It's his 4th year teaching writing and related enthusiasms at Duke. Oscar chose The Age of Wonder, the Romantic Generation and Discovery of Beauty and Terror of Science by Richard Holmes. He states that he selected the book because, as a teacher of writing, I would recommend this work to anyone who wants to see how a narrative can be put together. In other words, though I am neither a historian or a scientist, I simply admire the craft. So let's get the conversation started. As always, we welcome your emails to join in the conversation, either about the questions, the 5 questions that we've put to you earlier, or anything else that comes up along the way. So tell me, what is it that, first of all, pleasure to have you here.
Nice meeting you.
As a novelist, what attracted you to this book?
Let's see, I was working on the corrections for Beautiful Maria, and what I tend to do when I'm working on novels is look at anything that has nothing to do with what I'm writing. And so, I tend to like histories, and like Simon Winchester is a writer I'm interested in. I like looking at his work. I love Lytton Strachey, which I think this book owes something to. And I think I read a review of it in the New York Review of Books, and I said I'd check it out. And I was pleased that it turned out to be pretty well written, because I spend a lot of my time reading books like with a marker and fixing up the grammar. I mean, as best as I can. And I found that I was just simply sort of elated by sort of the clarity of the prose, but also the story I really enjoyed. And let me just put it this way. When I'm going down a road here in Durham, and I don't have a hard time imagining carriages, horse and carriages from the old days. It's just, there's this place in my head that just goes back in time naturally. And when I think of London, I see these guys in powdered wigs, or it's Charles Dickens' time. So I like books that transport me there and allow the reader to be part of the creative process, which is you fill in the blanks, you fill in the pictures, and I felt like I could do that with this book. It was just fun to move through that world.
Yeah, and it is a world that we've seen before. This is the one that's, as you said, this is the one that's reflected in the movies. 19th century London, the wigs, the carriages, and the balloons flying overhead, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's, first thing, the book opens with this fellow Joseph Banks is a young man who later became the president of the Royal Geographical Society for 42 years in Tahiti. And the first thing that hits you, of course, are the movie images of Tahiti, and you start filling all that in, and suddenly I'm thinking about Marlon Brando and that whole milieu. But if you can probably tell that my mind tends to be digressive, so if you can bear with me, I'll try to stick to the themes as they come up.
Well, and the book does too. I mean, I had the sense that the footnotes themselves could have been another book. And their footnotes worth reading. I mean, I check out the first few footnotes in any book to see if I'm going to go further, and I couldn't stop reading them in this book.
Well, they're pretty. It's very humorous, and I found. I mean, what he does is he uses his footnotes. He has a regular narrative, and we can talk about that a little bit. But he basically supplements his narrative by this sort of. He's obviously a digressive thinker who's got so much information at his disposal that he doesn't know what to do. Right. He doesn't know what to do with it. And so he says, I think I'll bother people and put it on the bottom of the page.
Right.
And And so, but generally they jump back and forth in time. For example, here's this wonderful section. One of the protagonists in the book is the astronomer William Herschel,
Right.
and his younger sister Caroline. And basically, he is best known for developing a vision of the expanding universe, and all of its implications, theologically speaking and psychologically speaking, in terms of the human race, but also for discovering the planet Uranus. I was trying to say it in a way that doesn't sound obscene. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Right.
And essentially, he's got this footnote that has, something about Herschel and his telescopes. And the footnote has, first of all, goes to Thomas Hardy, taking up amateur telescoping in support of a novel that he's writing, which I can relate to because I actually once ground my own Newtonian reflector mirror while I was writing my first novel. And it goes into this whole thing about how the telescopes figure in his book in astronomy. And then it goes into his text about Richard Holmes himself and the first time he looks through some old telescope, I think at Greenwich or I forget, Cambridge. And then the third digression ends up with the Hubble telescope. And even though, he sort of uses that it's novelistic to me in the sense that he uses that opportunity he sees a door and he walks through it and you follow him because it, most often or rather than not, it's interesting information. He's got he talks about all kinds of things in these footnotes, and I found myself being rather enchanted by some of them, although let me see if I can find my notes on this. My own footnotes on the footnotes. Yeah, he talks about, some of the things he gives a capsule biography of Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish naturalist. He mentions that Banks, our protagonist, the guy whose narrative holds together this book, wrote over 50,000 letters in his life. Yeah. And the notions of Tahiti as a paradise lost. He mentions the musical works of Herschel. He was also a composer. Right. And he also says that you can get his music on CD. So if that's not digression, I don't know.
Well, let me follow up on this part of the question to make sure we get all of these in, because the second part of your first question is what are some of the criteria for solidly written books?
I would say I think there's a certain ease. I think if it makes it easy to read, if you don't have to work too hard. As a teacher writing, I think I can speak English almost. As a teacher at Duke, the hardest stuff to write is not the stuff that's being redundant there. That's not well done. It's the stuff that's the prose and so forth that's horribly done. So my job is to make it a pleasure for the reader, and so I'm always trying to keep my students in line, and I bring those same principles to books when I pick them up. And what are the constructions like? I've picked up some very popular novels, very wonderfully lauded novels that have come out recently. And I'll look at the first few paragraphs, and I'll say, no. I don't like loosely written prose. And so I can tell right away if a piece of writing will pull me into what I would call the dream of that consciousness. Really, if you think about books, any books are really about consciousness closed, You can have discussions about internet and all this stuff. To me, it's too public to be as intimate as a book. And I love that feeling of intimacy when you enter into a world. And again, Lytton Strachey is someone, speaking of English letters, who I enjoy because he somehow developed a very intimate tone with his readers and covered a lot of territory at the same time. And he was fun to read.
Well, and I think that's true of this book. It really brings us to the second question, because I think we'll start pulling some of these threads together. The sentence structure in here is wonderful. You start with the very basics, right? You start reading the sentences, and sure, you're pulled in. The stories are great. Who is this Joseph Banks? You're imagining that time of wonder. Then there's this sort of next, you come back a little bit, the structure of the book itself.
Mm-hmm.
We're following Banks throughout. We lose him occasionally. Then we close up on the Herschels, and then we come back to Banks, and we hear about Mungo Parks, and so what, and the footnotes, which I began to think were not just footnotes, but that were strategically placed, as you said, novelistic. Do you think that was true? I mean, is there describe the way this book is put together and how the architecture of the book itself contributes to some of the meaning?
Well, to begin with, Joseph Banks, who the author, Richard Holmes, drops his right into Tahiti in the beginning, and he's very clever. He sets it up. In fact, the line that gets to you is on 13 April 1769, young Joseph Banks, official botanist to His Majesty's bark Endeavour, first clapped eyes. Clapped. I wasn't sure about that choice, but first clapped eyes on the island of Tahiti, 17 degrees south, 149 west. He had been told that this was the location of paradise, and then boom, and you're off. And then suddenly the next section goes into Banks was 26 years old, tall and well built, and then it goes into his whole past and his aristocratic upbringing and how he even bought his way into this voyage. And basically, as a technique, I noticed that Richard Holmes does the same thing over and over again. He'll drop someone into a situation. For example, Banks comes back from Tahiti, and he becomes involved with the Royal Society and is elected its president. He's sitting in his office, and this is how the second chapter starts off, which is about William Herschel. He hears about this brilliant young astronomer living in the town of Bath, a city of Bath, and he sends one of his, the secretary of the academy, of the society, to meet him, and boom, he goes from there, and suddenly it goes into a whole long thing. Suddenly they go out moon observing late at night, and he just proceeds. He just has these little set pieces that he sort of introduces a place, a notion, and then he introduces the people involved, and then he goes into the past or the process. I'm not answering your question.
Well, no, you are, because that's exactly a description of the book. Do you think he had control over that process, or was it just, I've got to get back? I forgot about Banks. Let's get back to Banks.
Frank, one of the pleasures in composing books is that, he refers to, in terms of science, this eureka moment when discovery is suddenly made. But when you're writing narratives, I remember something Mario Vargas Llosa said about writing books in general, said your first draft is usually intended to discover the world and the ideas that you want to write about, and then the subsequent drafts are about how do you structure it and what events become what I would call the hooks that draw the reader in. And I think he was very aware of it. But it's a kind of sleight of hand that only a really experienced writer can pull off. I mean, I'm old school myself, so I like seeing the gears and the pulleys working. I love all that stuff. But essentially, he builds a whole narrative, hopping, as it were, from different points in Banks' own life. And it's for me. I found that there's something I have a very dark side. I don't know if you've read the Mambo Kings Play Songs of Love, but it's about an older man. I wrote that book when I was in my 30s, saying, one day young man, next day old man, and he's only 61, and I'm going to turn 60. So I'm really depressed now. But essentially, I found there was something elegiac about this containment of the story, because it follows Banks to the end of his life. And he starts out his life as an adventurer who spends 3 years sailing around the world. And can you imagine how incredible that? I mean, it must have been like we think in terms of pockets of time and days and weeks. Right. This guy lived in a continent of time, and I can't imagine what dreams he had. And that's another thing. If a book makes me think about how dense life was at a certain moment. I mean, they were thinking about their days very much as we do. I mean, I try to at least 10 minutes a day, but in essence, I found it very elegiac, and just I don't know.
Well, that density is. I want to stay with that for a minute because it seemed to me. I want to get your thoughts on whether there's some kind of metastructure to this book. Look, here's what he's talking about. He's talking about this age of discovery, where people are going someplace they don't know where it's going to take them, so it's leading to they're going from a static, stationary world, essentially the world that God created with man in the center and the world go right, to a world that's going to explode and become ultra dynamic and lead eventually to a theory of relativity where all things are in relation. And they're in that threshold. He's trying to describe this moment in the book. Is that why, do you think, or does it contribute anyway to our understanding of this amazing moment in Western history to place these footnotes down here that are long and digressive, to thread in the travelers and discoverers among the poets and the inventors, because that's how their minds were working and that's how these discoveries were taking place. Chance meetings between people, a poet here, a discoverer there.
It's kind of interesting. I mean, I think it's the way his mind works, and I think he's. I found myself actually picking up some of his other books, like Footsteps, and he did a thing on Coleridge, and I have another one that he did about Shelley, whose poetry I rather liked. My favorite poet in the book was Shelley. I have no idea why, but and I think I would see in some of his footnotes he talk about other writers. And I'd end up buying their books or getting their books. And then I'd look at some of the other writers. Like, he talks about this guy named Joseph. I'm trying to remember his last name now. But he writes these books about, social history of madness, and about medicine. And so I'll just go check it out. And he also uses footnotes. So I think there must be a kind of secret cult somewhere in England where they have a club where everybody uses footnotes, but that went thunk, didn't it?
No, I was going to say, you can certainly imagine inventors doing just that. I mean, that's sort of how your mind has to work. You're sort of fixed on a problem, and then all of a sudden this kind of transient thought comes in and begins to play against. And I think that's what these characters were doing, too. They are poets. I mean, they're poets and they're inventors. And they bring that kind of poetic imagination, in a sense, to what it is they're doing. I mean, it feels a little different than the way we do science. I'm not saying that imagination isn't part of science, but it's a different sort of imagination than we think, than we feel these inventors are applying.
Yeah, I mean, there's fortunately I made too many notes. I can't find it right now. But there's a wonderful definition of science and creativity from Davies, who of course was involved with all kinds of the uplifting lifting the profile of chemistry and explaining processes, and there's a lot of fun stuff with him in Laughing Gas. But he was quite a good poet, I think. I found his work very elegiac, and he makes a statement at one point. You can go out and go out and catch a movie. He says at a certain point later in the book, where he's somewhat older and worldly, and poor guy ends up not living that long, but the quote is, "Imagination as well as the reason is necessary to perfection in the philosophic mind. A rapidity of combination, a power of perceiving analogies and of comparing them by facts is the creative source of discovery." And so I think it's sort of like a give and take between the creative and the intellectual. And I think that I guess one of the arguments in the book, or suppositions in the book, is that you think of the romantic mind as basically, it seems pagan when you read some of this stuff, and rather emotionally wrought, whereas science is supposed to be more rational. But I think in the context of this age, science opens up. It sort of takes the universe and brings it in to people's heads, literally, in a way they start thinking about it in a way they never did before, and
Well, and you get the feeling that they're trying to answer the big philosophical, emotional questions. Why are we here? I mean, they're going to find that at the end of the telescope. I don't know that science is looking for that particular answer these days. So, you know, you can imagine that people engaged in the process were a little bit different emotionally.
And the theosophical, I mean, the theological implications are pretty amazing. I found that intriguing about the book because it's not in any way about, you know, the G word, God, or all that, but in the way it hums through it.
Sure. It
just hums through the narrative. It's an unstated, it's got an unstated presence, and I mean, he even quotes Herschel as saying referring to God as the great must be, you know. And I found it very intriguing.
Yeah. No, how you define these things and how you have to recontextualize everything you learned, and if you want to maintain your concept of God and the divine, then how do we do that in the face of what we just learned? Darwin's shock at Herschel's conclusion that so since everything is expanding, it's probably one day all going to collapse on itself, and the shock at considering the possibility of this once static universe.
And he writes he writes about it in his poetry, and I mean, I'm probably jumping way ahead, but in terms of the poetry in this book, I really I remember in school reading romantic poetry, and I admired it on certain levels, but it wasn't for me because you know, frankly, being up at 137th Street in Harlem. and reading about all these delicate and pensive images did not speak to my soul in the way I wish it had at the time. But when you put it into context and you come across a poetry in this book and you see that, they're reacting to this whole other thing, and, you know, I found that very intriguing.
And the fact that poets were attending scientific lectures, which I hadn't really, I mean, why not? But the pictures created in this book of Coleridge, you know, going to lectures and then coming back, and Keats, you know, putting this stuff into there after attending the lecture.
Or if you think, if you think about Shelley, Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, she went to one of Davies' lectures when she was 14 years old. And at the time, there was a big discussion about vitalism and using galvanic energy to bring back life. So it's a very gruesome and I thought funny anecdote about an Italian scientist in London trying to bring back this convict who's been dead by shocking him. And it was grisly, but obviously that is something she never forgot. And in fact, you know, it's nice to read that she perhaps based her character of, I think it's called Victor Frankenstein on Davies.
Although contradicted the scientist of the age, and I think Davies himself, I don't remember who it was, who warned, you know, everybody not to take off on these flights of fancy. Don't imagine what we're going to do with this, or these kind of ideas of reanimating human beings. And she thought, yeah, but what if I did?
I know I love it. I mean, that's the whole thing. I mean, I'm not going to go search through my notes again, but I found it fascinating that basically she was a young girl in her 20s when all this came to her, and I think of her as the age of my students at Duke. And so you know, whatever, if you're out there and you have kids at that age, encourage them to write Frankenstein kind of books.
Well, and think it through. I mean, she actually pioneered a whole form. There was no science fiction before Mary Shelley.
That's true. Absolutely. I mean, well, yeah, I mean, maybe you could argue maybe Jonathan Swift and that sort of Lucian, you know, all these fantasies about outer space travel and this stuff. But I know what you mean. Yes, absolutely. Not in the continent in the way that we know it. And also, I mean, Frankenstein. I mean, think about it. It's so part of modern consciousness to think that it's started someone going to, in essence, a lecture.
A lecture. We have a question from Juliana. Many sources for the book were obtained from the characters' correspondence, journals, etc. Given today's electronic world, how will these texts be obtained for current scientists?
Interesting. Someone asked me how did I feel about ebooks?
Yeah.
And I think, in fact, that a library, an old gentleman's library in 50 or 60 years will be jammed with old ebooks. And I'm wondering if the technology will be keeping up, or I think it will be a bit of a joke with everything going on computer now. I think it will be a miracle if, in fact, people are able to retrieve all the information. It's just not the same anymore. Right. I have my papers at Columbia University, and actually, from their point of view, they're really interesting. For the years I used a typewriter, which was until about 1990-something, really? 95, 96. I'm really out of it, man.
Wow. And did you use carbon paper? Let me just ask.
I used I remember mimeograph sheets.
Wow. Yeah, but 1990s. Okay, but go ahead.
I'm really out of it. I'm just getting into the Wi-Fi thing now, so it doesn't take me 2 hours to download The Simpsons or whatever I'm watching. Essentially, the more interesting stuff is the non-computer generated manuscripts, and it's a complaint of periodicals like the Paris Review that now modern authors depend too much on the word processor or that function in computers, and therefore all the history, all the archaeology of their thinking is lost. That wasn't a very interesting thought, or you end up cutting things that you shouldn't, or you lose things. I really don't know how things will be retrieved.
Although, if you're curating your own letters and things, I mean, the server is going to lose those letters and things in 5 or 6 years. But on the hunch that the people you sent them to are saving some of them, I don't know that they'll be lost forever. It is a good question. They're certainly prone to be lost. On the other hand, they're easier to keep, right? I mean, you can keep thousands of them in a single disk.
There's too much paper, too much information in the world, too many advertisements, too much of everything, except for books. Good books are, pretty much a rarity still.
They should take up space, and then you have to make choices. You've got so much shelf, and you have to decide. Let's get to the next part of your third question.
I'm glad I skirted that answer, too.
Well, we addressed it, but it is hard to know. I mean, on the one hand, every letter that's ever written could be saved. On the other hand, if you don't curate your own letters, they're not going to be saved at all. What is the impact of William Herschel's varied telescopes?
Oh, my goodness. I mean, essentially, of course, it opened up, our perception of space and time, and he mentions this whole notion that there's geologic time was sort of discovered concurrently with this sense of deep space, and but he obviously dwells on Herschel's incredible accomplishments. I just found it completely intriguing from the sense of wishing I could have been. It's one of those wishing I could have been there spots. But I'm sure he wasn't the barrel of laughs. I had a lot of. There's some description in there of him sort of making these mirrors, the speculum, and grinding them for 16 hours at a time. And having worked on my own. Sorry about that. I just tapped the microphone. Having worked on my own mirror, I can tell you it's tedious and it's hard, and you really have to use elbow grease at times. And this little mirror I worked on wasn't very big, and I can't imagine what he did. I see it from a working class point of view. It's just the amount of labor these people put into their efforts. As far as Herschel opening up the universe, some sarcastic Frenchman said, I have, speaking of peering into the universe via these giant telescopes, some skeptical Frenchman said, I've looked everywhere in the universe and I have not found God. So I think that, in a nutshell, sort of puts everything in perspective in terms of what he was saying. Where is this divinity? Of course, the other theory is the universe is God. So, but I don't know why that. As far as that question goes, I really don't know how to answer it, except to say that I saw it as remarkable physical feat.
Sure, because it did open up all the speculation. And again, I think what Holmes makes very clear is that this is the age of romanticism, when people aren't looking at discoveries, not necessarily to commodify them, and not in and of themselves, but because they're part of these bigger questions that draw philosophers, poets, inventors, and travelers as well. His relationship with his sister, I actually found that the most compelling story in the book.
She sort of comes off as this self-sacrificing, very tiny little woman, apparently smallpox marked, and she devotes her life to him, to William Herschel. And he's the one who brings her over to England when he's gone there to become a musician. And she is his man Friday, so to speak, and a wonderful astronomer in her own right. But I made a note somewhere along the lines of, I realize I made too many notes, folks, along the lines of, I'll give them to you, 50 cents. I said, there's a triangle. It was Herschel, his sister, and astronomy.
Yeah.
And then I think you mentioned something that happens.
Then he gets married. He has, he's in his 50s, and he gets a girlfriend. And I was hurt. I was hurt.
Yeah.
You can't leave your sister. You've developed this.
She was the most sympathetic person. Wonderful. She lived in 98 or something.
And a scientist herself, and I think someone who carried on in the field too. And Banks, to his credit, I think made sure that she was recognized as a scientist, which another remarkable thing given the times and how women were seen back then.
I think that, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in those days, but books like this are the best thing you can be. I wouldn't call it a fly on the wall book, but it's nice you are there. I like that quality in a narrative, and I don't know. But again, I have to say my favorite section was there's a whole. The book's narrative basically goes between Humphrey Davies, the chemist, and William Herschel, the great astronomer, and with some side trips to, I enjoyed the chapter about the balloonists and all that, about ballooning becoming a big craze, and suddenly people being able to look down at the Earth and seeing that it has patterns and all this, and a couple of randy anecdotes in there with Mrs. Sage, the actress, climbing into a balloon and everyone checking out her bloomers and that sort of thing. A little tragedy in there, too. The James Sadler, the British balloonist who tried to go up to Ireland and didn't quite succeed. His son imitated him getting killed. And you have that same tragedy sort of echoed in the story of Mungo Park, because he goes to Africa for the second time, looking for this Timbuktu, and gets in trouble, never comes back. His son, years later, Thomas Park, goes after him, and he dies. So there's these underpinnings of sort of tragedy in this book that are have nothing to do with telescopes, but
epic, but epic tragedy and epic heroism too, and individualism. These individuals on a crusade. Talk about Park. He says, "I don't care if I die. I'm going to find this thing." And then there's that marvelous moment where he discovers that he's had it. He's naked. He's in the middle of nowhere, and he sees that little thumb of moss sticking up, and he's revived. It's I remember.
It's life-giving. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Survival of the moss.
Survival of the mossist. I think survival of the mossist. But it was a time, it was a particular period of time when that sort of thing was glorified. I remember reading a book about a contemporary nonfiction book about a guy a Brit, who had done a walk from Tierra del Fuego to the North Pole. It took him 6 years.
My God.
Right? And but he saw himself, and now I see who he believed he was heir to. He thought he was heir to this legacy of great British discoverers. So there's this really sad moment when he climbs aboard a Panamanian freighter. It was a British freighter in Panama. And he announces himself to the crew and tells them what he's doing. And they curse him and they look at him and they laugh at him, because this is, the 20th century. And it's like, what a knucklehead. And he's thinking, but don't you know, I'm. And so he was lost in the same world that has very clearly changed from them.
Absolutely.
let's move on to the next question. Well, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, but I think I want to save that to the end, sort of how things have changed and how we see this era, the Romantic era, against our own. But let's go to question 4. Consider how Richard Holmes describes the scientific opening up of the world at that time, and the effect it had on so many poets.
Interesting. I had my wonderful poetry section over here, and
I see you actually have another book.
I know this is my book about the book that.
In addition to the Footnotes, which is another book.
You mentioned Erasmus Darwin, who wrote in 1791. He published
Chuck's grandfather.
That's true. The Botanical Garden, which in fact was the most popular book during the 1790s. It was a big hit. Sold something like 20,000 copies, which was a lot back then. Considering that books were fairly expensive. And, of course, he's very much under the influence of alcohol and... No, I'm thinking about myself. No, wait.
Erasmus Darwin, now the lawsuits are filed.
I know. Let me just find this for a second, Frank.
Sure.
I thought I was trying to be really organized, folks, and...
Well, you're talking about the impact on poetry.
You can't.
No, go ahead. I'm just.
You just sing a song. Tell an anecdote about. What was the most?
I feel they had that whole long anecdote about this book that I read, and now.
I know, and I'm stuck. Oh yeah. You know what's interesting? My favorite image, actually. Speaking of anecdotes, in there, there's one of George III.
Yeah.
When Herschel was building his 40-foot telescope. Which, interestingly enough, when he died years later, it was right outside his window, and that was the last thing he basically looked at, which I found very moving. They had this what they call the Royal Garden Party, and King George. What people would do is they hadn't put the lens in, but the mirror in, but it was big enough that people could stroll through it, sipping champagne or whatever they drank in those days, and. At one point, King George III tells the Archbishop of Canterbury, he says, "Come to me and I'll show you the way to heaven." And that's the kind of thing that maybe it's apocryphal, I don't know, but it sounds really good. And
and I guess that's the other thing. There was a popular press at the time, and so this wasn't just a conversation among scientists. And you get that feeling in the book. You sort of feel the populace also kind of... vibrating with excitement about the possibilities of these discoveries.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to spend the rest of this program just looking through this, these notes.
Welcome to Looking for My Notes.
You could. That's why it took me 34 years to get through college. I was very conscientious about this. Here's my formal little speech about this, and vote for me in November.
This better be good.
I know it's not. It's a very sneaky book in the sense that it's not about romantic poetry, or it's supposedly about the Age of Wonder. But he sneaks in more poetry than it first meets the eye. In fact, it's another constant. It's something else that's constantly humming through all the stories. I mean. It's most wonderfully. I personally like the poetry of Humphrey Davies, who grew up in the countryside in Cornwall and near the town of Penzance on a beautiful estate. Became very much naturally involved in, I think, a dreamer. Started dreaming and thinking in terms of beautiful images and responding to nature, which is a theme that runs all through his life. And he starts writing poetry, and the poetry gets him into thinking more complicatedly, and he ends up drifting because of exposure to a library. He's interested in literature, into different kinds of writing, including those of Lavoisier, the French chemist who was guillotined in 1790-something. And so life begins. But he wrote the most beautiful, just the most beautiful sort of almost I would call post-pagan naturalistic poetry. I loved his stuff, even though Holmes says it's kind of second-rate. Each to his own, right? But you mentioned before that this notion of Erasmus Darwin sort of being perplexed by this notion of the universe ending suddenly and so forth. And it's a quote I found. To star after star from heaven's high arch shall rush, suns sink on suns, and systems crush, headlong extinct to one dark center fall, and death and night and chaos mingle all. I found that quite interesting, and I don't like easy rhyme, but I guess back then it was very hip.
Very common.
But it's also, the founding of Herschel discovering the planet Uranus. It's a great achievement of this day, of the age, and in fact, Keats ends up reflecting on it in his poem called On First Looking into Chapman's Homer. Then I felt like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez, parenthetically it should be Balboa, right, when with wondering eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. I found there's an earlier poem by William Cowper, who was a famous depressive, who I read about in this other book about a social history of madness. As I said, when I'm writing, which I've been doing again lately, I can't, anything to get me out of my own, state of mind. As anyone hearing me now would know, I'm definitely not insane, so I felt I could, there's another irony. I found that we were talking about the story of Mungo Park.
Yeah.
And so this young adventurer, this doctor, this really brilliant young man ends up being lost there. And apparently the story of Mungo Park inspired Tennyson and Keats in his Nile sonnets, and Shelley in a poem called Alistair, or the Spirit of Solitude in 1815, which reflects upon the spiritual aloneness of the desert traveler who pursues a perilous river and knows he will probably never return. And I thought I would read just a little bit of that. Is that okay with you?
Please do.
And if anyone, and I never thought I would love Shelley so much, but I found there's something, to me, in terms of chops, in terms of his ear for language, I thought Shelley was the best of all the poets. So I'll probably be offending a lot of 19th century and 18th century people. The poet wandering on through Araby and Persia and the wild Carmanian waste, and over the aerial mountains which pour down Indus in oxes from their icy caves, in joy and exultation held his way, till in the vale of Kashmir, far within its loneliest dell, where odorous plants entwine, beneath the hollow rocks a natural bower, beside a sparkling rivulet he stretched. Anyway. And I have tons more, but I guess we don't have that much time.
It's beautiful stuff, but it's also interesting that this poetry at times glorified and amplified these events, and at other times expressed horror. I mean, absolutely. Blake was endless.
I love Blake, though.
Right?
Right. Interesting. He's curiously absent from this narrative, and I think probably because he was all unto himself in terms of his poetry and his beliefs, and I talked to angels and spirits from the beyond, and I mean, I think he's always included in the romantic poets.
Right.
So
well, he was very critical of this. His poetry and essays on Newton were famous because he really believed that this was narcissism at its highest, and a kind of hubris that was going to be the death of us all. I mean, he was worried, and in the sort of Frankenstein mode, where's this taken us?
Absolutely.
And who are you to play God? Why are you playing God? God is a mystery, and you're taking all the mystery. And I think that was much of Blake's concern. But also the kind of genius of this poet too. Byron's association, Adam and Eve in the garden, and Newton's apple and their apple, and he's right. I mean, this sort of beautiful parallels, recontextualizing biblical history now in the face of these new discoveries. To what extent do you think the poetry of the age popularized these notions and actually gave it the strength that it would need, the economic strength to actually continue. I mean, otherwise we've got a bunch of crazy people who are determined to go forward, but without support, they don't go very far.
Well, I mean, I don't know that much about history of the times, of this time, I mean, in terms of the economy, but I would imagine that the majority of people weren't educated. Mm-hmm. And so we're talking about just about every poet mentioned in here, and unless some people had lucky breaks like the young Davy, I mean, we're talking about a more affluent and educated class who I think in any case would have been aware of all these developments. Do I think that the average Tiny Tim's Miss Bob Cratchit walking down the street on his way to Scrooge's shop knew about these, these developments? Maybe in the popular lore. That's why the ballooning craze was so. Yeah. I mean, they say that when balloons first went up in Paris, the crowds of 500,000 gathered there, and that the next time you saw that kind of crowd was for the French Revolution. So I think that it probably, in terms of reaching out to different classes, I think it was more upper crust.
Did it generate interest among them? I mean, in a way that maybe the discovery would have been lost on them.
Interestingly enough, I think Holmes implies in his narrative that most this aristocratic class were not the most ambitious. I mean, he even commends Banks for being the kind of risking his life, basically, going on these journeys. But my impression is that no, I think that. I think things entered the popular lore and conversations. I mean, getting back to Herschel, I mean, I love the fact that he actually believed there were people on the planet, on the moon. And who knows? I mean, they were opening up the universe, but they also believed that there were possibly millions of inhabited planets.
Right.
And
well, then what does it do to us all when he discovers that the Milky Way is not the only galaxy? There are other galaxies out there now. We're not the center of God's attention anymore. I mean, even if whatever you think of the deity, there's a lot more to think about than we.
Shelley had a remark about that in which he said basically, I mean, he wrote this beautiful poem about the moon, which I'd love to read, but it'd take too much time. But he basically said, how can you possibly believe, given what we know now, that a Jewish woman in this distant country gave birth to the Son of God, when you know that it's such a vast. So when he died basically the same time as Herschel. Herschel got 3 big pages in the London Times and all those publications, and Shelley got ribbed. He said, a poet named Shelley has died. He will find out if there be a God or no. So. I mean, it can. I mean, this book obviously has so many facets, and unfortunately, it's a digressive book, and I'm a digressive person, so we're hopelessly lost now.
We're not, because let's see if we've answered this fourth question. Consider how Richard Holmes describes the scientific opening up of the world at the time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We did that, and its effect on so many poets. We did that. So let's go to the last one.
Okay.
What makes this book novel? Do you think this is novelistic in its approach? I think we've talked a little bit about the style and structure.
Think that, I mean, I pick up books sometimes, and nonfiction can be really great, or it can be a grind.
Yeah.
I mean, some people just don't have an ear, and I think Holmes has been around studying very carefully writing for so long. I mean, I find it curious that the book excludes the romantic novelist. That to me, but that's his world. But he writes like a good prose novelist would. He describes, I mean, he's got one description early on in which he talks about Davy's Town, where you hear the boats creaking in the water and the wind blowing down the main street. And I don't know if you've been to Cornwall, but it's pretty much the way it is. And throughout he takes the extra care to reflect on nature and to describe it in ways that are really wonderful. Let me just see if I can find one little bit here. I mean, this is a line that any novelist would be proud to write about. It's about Davy's meeting the woman he falls in love with, Jane Apries. And this is the line. The mathematician, Professor John Playfair, who had superbly interpreted Hutton's geology to the world, was said to have once knelt submissively in Prince Street. in Princess Street to resolve the complicated stratifications of her laced boots. You know, that is, the guy gave some real thought to that sentence. Yeah. And so what I guess I meant to say, because I tend to be digressive, as you can probably tell, is that I think his quality is that his writing often has a quality of the kind of writing you would hope to find in good novels. And also, I mean, you think of, I mean, I read him and I think, he's obviously influenced by Bruce Chatwin, for example, who was also very descriptive. But he's got his own way of putting things together, and so I enjoyed it.
And he certainly works with characters. I mean, he knows how to develop a character, and they become the focal point.
Absolutely.
For us.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned that, the way the book works in essence is, he's got all these kinds of devices he uses. Ones are the footnotes, and they usually don't have anything to do with the actual moment that, it sort of alludes to. But he also talks about bigger things, like when he talks about Davies developing the lamp, the safety lamp for the mines. Right. He takes everybody off into this little excursion into the countryside where he notices marsh gases, and then decides to check them out and finds out that they burn at a very low flame, and it turns out to be some kind of methane, and that sort of works into the later narrative, in which in other words, he plants the idea in your head that something's going to happen, and he follows up on it. And so I found the Davies story in particular the most complete unto itself in a way, because there's not that much to say about Herschel, because most of what he did was pretty much intensely brilliant, but there's not the same kind of poignant narrative involved as there was with Davies, who I think died fairly tragically, and so now that I've cheered you up, folks,
it's important to do all that in a book like this. I think when you've got so much material, I mean, it's pretty clear that he could have picked any one of these and simply written a biography, and you would have gotten a lot of the flavor of the age and a lot of what's going on. You really chose to put all these characters in one place because they did come in contact with each other, and then to include these literary figures as well. But that's, I think, maybe something I want to talk about next, which is that he reflects this without really much commentary. This was a time of real possibility and hope. Humankind was going to move into its own now. And the possibility of eliminating pain and hunger and all of those travails of the human condition, it seemed to me, were in this moment. And now it has to strike us as, it did me anyway, as I mean, I understand that was then horribly naive. I remember the Wright brothers saying that the airplane was going to obviate war. There'd be no war anymore, because how could you fight a war if I could see what you were doing? Well, that's pretty naive to believe that your technological innovation isn't going to somehow be trumped, and there wouldn't be some kind of arms race. The failure to deliver on the promise is one of the saddest things to me when I see how excited, how romantically engaged all these people were, and to know that it didn't quite happen.
Well, what the book doesn't, I mean, it sort of circles around the notion that times were a-changing with the French Revolution and the whole ultimate superpower of the monarchies, and the world, and then it became more from the upper class, the ruling class point of view. It seemed to become more about survival rather than the kind of beneficence that. I also like the character of George III a lot in it. I don't know did these characters, any of these minor characters, jump out at you, Frank? Or?
They didn't, but I sometimes had to struggle to keep it all together, because there were times when we'd lose a character and they'd come back, and so I had to be judicious about where I was going to focus. A lot of detail.
Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, the guy has I can't imagine his gifts of, organization. I mean, it's a funny thing. When you write a novel, you have to sort of, the one advantage you have is that you can sort of be your own encyclopedia in terms of creating the world. When you're doing a memoir, which I've just finished, and it's coming out in June, it's called Thoughts Without the Cigarettes. Sorry. But, essentially, just remembering things exactly the way you think they were, or, I mean, that's really hard too. And then I come to a book like this, and I just the fact and detail management to me is this guy's got some kind of organized mind.
Would it be easier to do this because you've got so much fact to work with? You don't have to invent, and you don't have to worry about the plausibility because these characters really did this, so you know it turned out all right. It turned out, and I would think for a novelist, you come up with an idea, and the worry is it's so implausible at some point as you thread it out that you've got to drop the whole thing.
There's some books that impress. I don't think anyone else could do them. Like Robert Massey did this great book about Peter the Great, if you recall that. I mean, if you haven't read it, it's worth it. I would have loved to have talked about that, but that's even bigger than this one. So, I mean, and it's just a certain gift, and it's as I tell my students always, writing is about focus. And this is one focused fellow.
That's beautiful.
And how he did it. I mean, I'm impressed by all that stuff. And writing anything well is hard, and I think he did a good job with it.
A great job. Well, what a great pleasure talking with you.
Well, thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Oscar Hijuelos participating today in Duke Reads, and as he mentioned, Thoughts Without Cigarettes will be published, coming out this June. Just in time for the 4th of July. Stocking stuffers. Thank you so much. And I want to remind you, next session, Duke Reads, April 19th. Sue Wasilick, Vice President for Student Affairs, Dean of Students, going to be discussing To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Please send your questions in advance. Should be a great discussion, as always. The next office hours is March 18th. And we will be talking about neurobiology and medicine and engineering, psychology, brain science. It's going to be a lot, neuroengineering, so take a lot of questions on that, connecting brains and machines. That's March 18th. Office hours, please tune in. If you wish to listen to this session again, you just go to Duke On Demand in a day or so. We'll have it there. Meanwhile, see you next month.